This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to Roots and All, where today I'm chatting with environmental scientist and author Shannon Jade about her new book, A Song for the Earth, a poetic, hopeful take on the climate crisis. We talk about the themes in the book, the biomes she covers, our connection to nature, and the importance of finding your voice, whatever form that takes.
I started with an undergraduate degree in writing and publishing, and that was very much the direction I was travelling in. And then I sort of segued from that into a master's degree in environmental science. But I have found that they sort of marry together quite well in terms of science communication, climate communication. I think there's such a gap where it's just so important to look at the way that we're communicating and educating about these kinds of topics. So I really enjoy sort of getting to exercise both muscles in that way.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people listening have this real deep interest in the environment and probably horticulture if they're listening to this. But they also, a lot of them have this desire to communicate that to other people who might not be so aware. And some people go into garden design. You know, I started a podcast. You actually then moved into poetry. Did that come easily though?
I think there are certain elements of it that sort of lend towards poetry in the sense that, you know, the poetry is so tied up in sort of lyricism and beauty. And I think that one of the key things really in terms of climate conversations is, you know, if you want to make people care about the environment, you have to show them why it's a beautiful place worth saving. So I think that there was a natural sort of association, I suppose, towards poetry. But it wasn't probably my first initial thought. It wasn't something that I'd done a lot of. I'd definitely been sort of more in the novel sort of space. So it was an interesting challenge, but I think that it does tie up quite well with sort of nature writing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely it does. And so you sent me your book called A Song for the Earth. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so A Song for the Earth is a lyrical novel in verse designed to offer a hopeful perspective on the climate crisis. So the main character, January, journeys through Earth's major biomes and sort of discovers the beauty that these places have to offer, but also the challenges that they're facing ecologically. And she uses her poetry skills and abilities to begin a call to action in the cities and around the world to try and get the community to be a part of positive change to preserve the natural environment.
And so is it about bringing the stories, as you say, travelling to the biomes, and also there are the people there that she meets? Or is the main driver for her that she goes and discovers these places, but also the people, and then she brings those stories back and tries to amplify them to people?
I think a little bit of both. I don't think that she sets out sort of knowing necessarily how she's going to make this change. I think she's just sort of aware that it's something that she's interested in. And I think that was important to me writing the book because I think a lot of people feel that way. They know that they want to say something about nature and the environment, but they don't quite know where to begin or what to say. And it's by learning more and engaging with the community more that she learns what she actually wants to do and how she can use her own sort of skills and identity to be a part of driving this action.
And how much is the book autobiographical? Did you travel to these places?
No, not at all. I'd love to see these places. But no, it's been sort of an interesting experience actually, just sort of getting to travel vicariously through her, really.
And why did you choose the name January for her? Is that significant?
On one hand, I just like it. But I also think the name January feels to me very much synonymous with sort of new beginnings and sort of a fresh chapter, a fresh slate. And so I think that sort of made sense for somebody who was sort of stepping very much out of her comfort zone to sort of tackle things in a completely new way and to explore places that she had really no frame of reference for.
And at the beginning of the book, she leaves the city and you can tell she feels very disenfranchised. And a lot of people listening, again, will probably harbour desires to move out of cities. And it is a topic that I've covered before on the podcast. And I've always thought that leaving the city was kind of running away. I mean, I know I did it myself. But then reading the book, it's almost like she's kind of running towards something and it's like almost a destiny. And there's that more positive spin on it, I think.
Yeah, I think that was important for me. I mean, I think a lot of people, and myself included, you have these sorts of ideas of, I'd like to move to a countryside somewhere far away and sit with my little garden. But I liked the idea of empowering people who can't do that or aren't able to do that or aren't interested in doing that. You don't have to go and live on a remote homestead to do something positive for the environment. You can have a positive role and be part of that change wherever you're living, even if that's New York City.
So you don't actually have to experience it in order to empathise with the people there and to actually make the change.
Yeah, definitely. I think, we can sort of connect with people, particularly in this day and age of sort of remote globalization. I think that's one of the really amazing things about the era that we're living in is that there aren't really the restrictions that there would have been, even 50 years ago. We can connect with these ideas wherever we are.
And sticking with the city, there's a line in the book that says, in quotes, "Nothing is as simple as always staying the same." And there's this feeling that entropy is apparent and acceptable in wider landscapes, but it's kind of almost buried and denied in the cities. You don't see the change of seasons. Every last weed is suppressed. Everything is concreted over. Did you kind of consciously include that idea?
Yeah, I think so. I think with climate change, particularly, that's something that we see is a real challenge because I think in quite privileged inner city areas, it can be harder to see the impact as soon as the impact is visible in some of these biomes. So we would be seeing, major changes if we were living in, a coastal community. But that's not necessarily as easy to see as early on, even though it's happening and we know that it's happening. It does feel sort of further away and more removed. And I think that was part of what I wanted to sort of have January sort of travel to these places, see that firsthand, but also communicate it in an environment that will be experiencing the impacts of climate change, but isn't going to experience them in the same way or to the same degree as early on in time.
And is there a sense that, and I hate that this is the case, but possibly she's able to affect change more quickly or more impactfully in a city because that is where the decisions seem to be made?
Absolutely. There's sort of this disenfranchisement, I think, amongst a lot of people because it does feel very much like, you can do all of your own sort of steps towards taking a shorter shower or, swapping out your plastic straws. But if the changes aren't being made at a government level and they aren't being made at a corporate level, then it becomes very difficult to affect this change. So I think it's important that we all take our small little steps, but it's also important that we do go to the places where decisions are made and the people who are making those decisions and demand that action where it can be done at scale.
Reading the book, it is hopeful, as you say, but there's always this part of me that just thinks we don't deep down want change, because if we did, all we would need to do, and I know this is a big all, but we would just need to stop shopping and buying, and we don't stop consuming. And I feel personally very complicit in the breakdown of the environment because I really feel, if we wanted a revolution, I don't think it would be taken to the streets with placards. I think it would just be voting with our feet and our money. And there's always that part of me, the really pessimistic part that just says, well, we need to stop living the way that we do, and we're just not doing it. Do you think we're ready for that level of change?
I hope so. I think that there's definitely sort of variation within that. And there are definitely people who aren't, and communities who aren't. But I also think that there are communities who are interested in sort of making those changes. I think that we need policy to sort of push us in that direction because, yes, we could sort of stop spending and stop consuming, but that's not ever going to be sort of a universal effort. And that's why we need government policies that step in and change the way that the industries work so that the way that we consume as a society, as opposed to the way that we consume as individuals, is changed. And I think we need leadership to do that.
Yeah, I hate the fact that we do need to be told that, but I feel we're just not making changes quickly enough. So I have to agree with you there. You wrote, "My time has taught me how little it takes to make a big impact, for better or for worse." And I sat with that for a bit because I thought, well, quite often we think when we make changes for the negative, we quite often mark those and we see those. But when we make changes for the positive, sometimes they can take longer to manifest, or maybe they're less noticeable to us, or maybe we focus on the negative. Do you genuinely think humans as a species notice when we've done good as much as we notice when we've done bad?
I think you're quite right. I think we lean towards a bit more of a pessimistic point of view where we do sort of focus. And I think because sort of consequences tend to be easier to see than, the success stories. And I think that's something that we need to change within the culture, the way that we look at things and the way that we communicate, and particularly in sort of social justice actions like this, and community programs like this. I think we need to be going, okay, what have we achieved so far and how can we build on that? And I think that that would be a lot more empowering for people, and therefore probably a lot more likely to encourage a larger community to want to be part of that going forward.
So tell me about the biomes that you chose to visit. Why were they so key for you?
Yeah, so I think I wanted to sort of reflect sort of the diversity of the planet, in sort of the most succinct way possible, but that also showed the great variations between places. So you've got somewhere like, the rainforest compared to the desert. And obviously the challenges that they're facing are going to be very different. And I think that I wanted to point out that just because somewhere might look quite hardy and might look quite resistant to climate change doesn't mean that they're not facing major ecological challenges. And I wanted to sort of provide that comparison. I think we hear those conversations about sort of certain biomes. We hear about the challenges of, say, a rainforest maybe, but I don't know that we hear necessarily about how difficult climate change makes life in a desert or a savanna.
Yeah, that is a very good point, because the desert, as you say, you assume maybe that it's not got much going on in terms of biodiversity, or that it's very resilient because of the extreme conditions that it's subject to. How do you feel that stands up to climate change?
I mean, as a challenge is that there's issues that we don't know how to fix in any of these places. And for people who are living, working, spending time in these regions, the severity of those conditions is quite shocking sometimes. And I think that there is a tendency to think that something like the desert is quite resilient, we're expecting, well, they're used to the heat, they're used to sort of these extreme conditions, and we're not thinking about the increase of something like a sandstorm. We're not thinking about changes to biodiversity. We're not thinking about increased drought patterns or the many other challenges that face something like that. And I think it's really important to recognise that climate change isn't just going to affect the areas that you tend to consider most vulnerable. It's a global phenomenon and it affects everybody and everywhere.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would acknowledge that the rainforests and the Arctic, that they would know more about the issues there, but definitely the desert and the savannah, they were a really good inclusion. I mean, in terms of the savannah, how is that being affected?
The savannah is one of the major sort of challenges, is that I think it's about 4% of prairie grassland is left globally. So it is a very resilient landscape, but it is not foolproof, and biodiversity has been severely compromised. And it does, once again, tend to be one of those areas, because it's not as sort of stereotypically expected to be under threat. It doesn't receive the same kind of awareness or attention or the same kind of support to manage and mitigate those climate effects. And that's where the challenges become even greater, because we're not on the ground working at rewilding areas. We're not on the ground working at preserving this biodiversity, which often is, it'll be the only place in the world that will have certain species of plants and animals. And we're not fighting for it because it tends to not be considered something that is very obviously at face value under threat.
And the other thing that I thought about the book was that, obviously January sort of does this round trip, city to habitats to back to city. Is there a message there about how humans in general may well migrate more to cities as we kind of trash these wider landscapes?
I think so, yeah. Obviously within the framework of the story, it was sort of quite focused on her finding her way and wanting to sort of reflect the diversity of all of those places and share what she'd learned. That was probably the centre of her return, was that she felt that she didn't need to tell the people in these places what challenges they were facing because they were telling her what challenges they were facing. But she needed to bring that message to a city that wasn't experiencing it for itself and that may have a stake in helping to repair some of that damage. So I think that that sort of is at the crux of her purpose. But I do think that there is very much post-industrialization. The more unstable and unreliable our natural areas become, the more people rely on man-made infrastructure, unfortunately, as a replacement for actually looking after and preserving and restoring those natural environments that they've come from.
Picking up on the bringing stories kind of forward, I do want to go back to your credits in your book, because it did sound as if it took a certain amount of encouragement from other people for you to put your poetry out into the world and to use your voice in that particular way. And I really feel that the more we can empower people to do that, the more these stories will get told and the more people will just generally hear about the plight of other people and other landscapes. Have you got any words of encouragement for people who you think might have a story or might have a method of storytelling that they're not using at the moment just because they're a little bit afraid to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it was a challenge to sort of do something, I suppose, out of my comfort zone. And I think that that's something that a lot of people find. But the response has been overwhelmingly positive. And, I think that every voice that we have contributing to these sorts of conversations is valuable and important. And the more that we start to have this conversation, the more others have the opportunity to learn and then exercise their own ideas, creativity, and solutions towards these issues. So I think that, if you're sitting on a book or a song or, an artwork or whatever it is, an invention, you never know what is going to be the catalyst for something else that goes on to make the world a better place. So it's always worth taking that leap, I suppose, and sharing your voice, your ideas, and a bit of hope with a climate changed world.
Somebody messaged me yesterday and said that they'd been asked to do a talk and they had this fear that they didn't know everything about the topic. And actually, it must have been slightly scary to write about these places not having been there firsthand, and so you're relying on kind of research. And I think a lot of people feel if they've not done something themselves or they're not an absolute expert on it, that they can't write about it or can't speak about it. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that you are the leading expert on this particular thing. It's just that it's your take on it, and especially in your sense, it's fictional and it's a message and it's a story, and that's okay, to speak up and to not be a complete, like I said, leading expert on this subject. It's all right to just put your spin on it. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think nobody's an expert in everything. And, one of the challenges of these sorts of issues is that most people don't really have all the answers, don't know what to do. And even the most educated person, the person who's spent the most years in climate science, isn't going to have all the answers. And it's by having people from all kinds of backgrounds enter into the conversation that we have new innovation and new ideas and a community action. And so I think that there's a lot of value in sharing your ideas, even if you don't have ideas to solve every problem.
Yeah, good point. Picking up on the actual mechanics of the book, I love a bit of poetry. I love the way you can kind of direct the flow of the words, literally by how you place them on the page. It makes people kind of stop or pause, or the words can just, like some of yours do, they kind of drip down the page to give this particular sense. But I noticed in some of the book that you run words together. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that is sort of a key element of poetry, is sort of the way that it looks and the way that it sort of is designed to be read. And there are definitely periods in the book where I've wanted to create sort of a different emotional element or a different sort of sense of a place or an experience or an idea that January is going through. And I think that that's the beauty of poetry. It's not just sort of words on paper. It's the way that you arrange them can really make a huge impact on the way that people interpret them, which I think is really interesting and a fun challenge in poetry.
And with the words that you ran together, was it arbitrary or was there a method to it?
I would say that generally speaking, it sort of is just what it felt that the story was calling for. I try not to be too prescriptive in something like this because I think that you don't want to sort of cloud out your creativity too much. but it's where it feels right for the story and it feels right for the message you're trying to get across more than anything else.
Okay. So will you resurrect January at all?
I don't think so. I think that this is her story. I feel that so much of her story is now it's inspiring other people to try and take action. And so I'd rather focus her journey now on what it can achieve in terms of empowering other people.
And what's next for you? Have you got any plans?
Yeah, so I'm working on another book now that will be quite different, and that will be hopefully releasing sometime next year. And so that's sort of where everything else is being thrown for the time being, as I continue to sort of chat about this book and sort of do all of the engagements that come with releasing a book like this. It's been a really interesting few months since it came out, and I'm really excited to sort of keep going with the environmental message, I suppose.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on it. Where can people connect with you, or where can they get the book?
Yeah, so I'm everywhere on social media as Shannon Jade Author, and on our website as Shannon Jade Author as well. And the book is available pretty much everywhere. So it is in some brick and mortar stores, but if for whatever reason your local store doesn't have it, it's in all of the regular online ordering locations. And most booksellers can also order a copy in.
Thanks to Shannon for talking about finding your voice and communicating your thoughts to the world. And thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 336, Creating an Arc, and episode 340, The Nature of Resilience. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.